Welcome back to Digging Deeper Ag Chats with Al, the podcast where we explore the latest innovations, practices and ideas driving modern farming in Gippsland and beyond. I'm your host, Alistair McCaleb, and today we're diving into the world of livestock nutrition with a guest who brings both passion and expertise to the table. Joining us is Jess Revell, an independent livestock nutritionist and the founder of Ruminant Livestock Services. Jess has a wealth of experience in dairy, beef and sheep nutrition, and today we're focusing on the topic that's becoming increasingly important for producers: the nutrition and health of sheep in containment and feedlot systems. Growing up in a shearing shed in Tasmania, Jess developed a deep-rooted passion for livestock and animal production, which has led her to a career in ruminant nutrition. In this episode, she shares practical insights into designing effective containment systems, managing feed rations, and ensuring optimal animal health. We'll cover a range of topics including induction onto grain, water quality, the cost of gain calculations, and how to maintain consistent growth rates. Whether you're new to containment feeding or looking to refine your current practices, Jess's knowledge will help you to maximise productivity while keeping your livestock healthy and thriving. So let's dig deeper into the essentials of sheep nutrition with Jess Revell. Now, Jess, you're a self-confessed nerd who grew up in a shearing shed in Tasmania. Can you just tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, thanks, Al. Thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm the eldest of two. I grew up on small acreage in Tassie. Dad was a shearer and had a shearing contracting business for 20 or 25 years. And early on, Mum was a shearer's cook and rouseabout, so we grew up in shearing sheds, and that's probably where my passion for livestock and animal production started, and probably a strong work ethic as well. Dad had lease country, and so we'd spend weekends out there doing all things sheep related and riding our ponies. And then I wanted to be a vet after that interest, but wasn't a great scholar at school, so I didn't get the marks to get into vet science. But in year 12, they offered an ag science scholarship where we could spend a week going through a heap of ag science businesses.
So was that during your year 12 year you did that scholarship?
Yes, so spent a week going through different agricultural businesses in Tassie. And that really opened my eyes up to the science behind agriculture and getting into that field. So when I left grade 12, I applied for a Bachelor of Ag Science with UTAS and spent 4 years in Hobart completing that degree. So in third and fourth year, really enjoyed, we did a lot more livestock production and animal subjects, really enjoyed those and had two really good mentors, Aduli Malau Aduli and Dr. John Roche, who's a nutritionist in New Zealand, and they opened my eyes up to the field of ruminant nutrition, which I really liked, as well as still wanting to be a vet. We were sort of preventing diseases before they happened with feed. So they opened up that area to me, and I ended up completing an honours, which was on feeding dairy cows different pasture species and different rates of grain and measuring milk production through that.
Away from sheep slightly into the dairy game, and that was where your first employment was?
Yeah, so then I moved into a dairy advisor role with the DPI and was there for a year, but still had that passion for ruminant nutrition and answered an ad in the Weekly Times for a nutritionist in Meningie in South Australia and had a phone interview and got the job and moved to Meningie and worked as a ruminant nutritionist over there for 4 years. Packed up the suitcase, didn't know anyone, and moved to that little town.
Only about mid-20s by this stage? Not even?
22, I think.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So big move.
Away from the Upper Isle and straight into South Australia. So Meningie was a great community. Played sport there for a period of time and met the locals, as you do when you move to different country towns, and really enjoyed working as a nutritionist, doing dairy, beef and sheep formulation of stock feeds and having a client base through the southeast.
Yeah. And where to from there?
There for 4 years and then got approached by Landmark or Nutrien now to do more of a production consultancy role, and that was more so into that beef and sheep sector, both extensive and intensive grazing systems, lots of feedlotting or containment feeding type systems, and talking about sort of nutrition and animal health through the southeast of South Australia.
Now, there was another role with a company in between, or
So then I moved to Victoria and started working for CopRice, formulating their pellets out of the Cobden mill in Victoria, and had a small client base as a consulting nutritionist for them. Then I seen a need for good independent advice without the product sell, and started my business at the start of COVID and haven't looked back from there. So I have a business, Ruminant Livestock Services, which provides independent livestock nutrition and animal production advice to dairy, beef and sheep producers across predominantly southern Australia now.
You've taken the big leap out of a well-paying job, saw the need to be independent, and straight into that industry. Firstly, the name, I really like the name. It's a double entendre. Was that on purpose?
It is a double entendre, and not many people pick that up. They think it's a spelling mistake.
Right.
So obviously spelt Rumenate. And the original marketing was going to hyphenate the 8, but I wanted a business name that encompassed both beef and dairy and also sheep. So bovine is sort of cattle related, ovine is sheep related, and rumen brings them both together. And being a predominantly nutrition consultancy business, the 8 is about what they're eating. So it isn't a spelling mistake, it is spelt right, but encompasses both feeding ruminants and also encompasses a lot of feed relation to the business. Yes.
So I really like that. Now, containment feeding, you've actually been down here at Gippsland Ag at one of our sheep production days. You've talked about containment feeding. We've set up a small feedlot just to demonstrate containment feeding. Why is it becoming more of a thing that farmers are doing and more of an essential tool for our farms?
So with the predominantly inconsistency of seasons and the variability in pasture growth in paddocks, originally it was a drought management strategy. So we would contain sheep in a small confined area and feed them a set ration until that drought broke. But now with the variability in seasonal conditions, we're seeing that happen obviously more often. And it's a risk management tool to feed sheep what they require, or even less when you put them in containment. Obviously, their requirements drop if we're feeding for maintenance.
Because they're not searching the paddocks all day long.
Right, they're not walking the paddocks all day. To be able to contain them into a small area, get them off paddocks, allow that pasture wedge to be built, and then put them out when we have built a good pasture wedge. But also other options for containment. So we might quarantine new sheep coming onto our property. We might use it to join ewes in, depending on our pasture situation, or we might use it to feed other classes of livestock like wethers or ewe lambs to target a certain growth rate. And there's obviously that finishing side as well. So with lamb prices strong currently, the budgets on feedlotting tend to be positive depending on a number of factors, but we're able to finish lambs in a really quick manner and take advantage of these higher prices at the moment.
Yep. Well, a couple of years ago, it was much tighter when trade lambs were $10 a kilo, whereas now when they're matching, it's actually there's a bit more fat in the system, I guess.
So margin in it at the moment.
Now, you mentioned a bunch of different containment feeding options there. The principles are actually, even though the feed ration might be different, the principles are very much the same, feeding animals or livestock in those systems. Those principles, once we know them well, are quite easy to manage if we're responsible with it. You just saw our feedlot out there. It's brand new, so don't be too harsh. But what are some of the things that you notice and some of the other mistakes that producers might make going into a new feed system?
So I find one of the biggest issues when setting up, firstly, is the design. So there's a lot of focus on the ration, but design is as important as feed.
The actual physical pen design?
Yep. And how you set that up. Getting that spacing correct for the amount of animals being put in, depending on what you're trying to do. So if we're trying to finish lambs, the smaller their area they have, the less walking that they will naturally do. Obviously, a ruminant's designed to graze, so we'll walk the area if it's given a big enough area to do so. When we confine them, we allow that energy all to be put into weight gain and have that quicker finishing system. So one of the things I noticed with the design out in the paddock was that a smaller number of lambs in the pen and quite a big pen size, which might encourage them to walk a little bit more, but you could correct that by putting more lambs in those pens, pending you have enough feed space.
the actual pen was designed to save fencing, which because we had an existing fence down the back.
Gains, or
That's
are we
right,
trying to
and
save
so
money?
for an extra half a day's worth of fencing, you're saying that we should have actually invested to shorten that pen up.
Shorten that pen or split them, yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then we can actually reduce the
Run
size
two
of the pens.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's counterintuitive, I believe, seeing lots of lambs in a pen. You think, oh, they're cramped, they won't like it. But socially, they're fine as long as they've got a certain square metres.
They will have a pecking order. So ideally, we try and aim for 2 to 5 metres squared per lamb and a maximum of 500 head per pen. But sort of 250, 300 we find ideal to reduce that pecking order or that shy feeder component. So you could actually have a feeder on each side. You've got an automated feeder in that system and split that pen in half.
Yep.
The other thing I find is the induction onto grain seems to be the biggest issues in these systems, whether you're feeding animals in containment for maintenance or whether you're trying to finish lambs. Obviously, within that, being a ruminant, they contain a rumen, which contains billions of microbes, protozoa and fungi, and they need time to adjust to different ration changes. So the number one issue I find when putting animals into containment is not allowing enough time for that induction onto their feed ration. So as we talked about a lot today was creating that good fibre mat in the rumen to allow that, if we're feeding grain, that grain ration or that high energy diet to be more slowly digested, and allowing that 10 to 14 days to be able to do that onto their set amount of feed.
The other thing that we don't think about enough is water and water quality. So having clean, fresh water is just as important sometimes as the quality of grain that we're feeding them.
Yeah, so if you think of body composition is around 85% water. If we have an example of trucking lambs out of the market or have been trucked long distances, then they've been off feed and water for a longer period of time, which we don't know how long. And the rumen needs that suspension of water to be able to have those feed particles suspended and allow the rumen microbes to digest those. But in terms of trough quality, sheep don't like warm water, they don't like dirty water. They'll drop their intake of water if we're not focused on water quality. If they're not drinking, they're not eating, and therefore they're not meeting our production targets. So testing the water in these containment situations is really important.
Very good. You just touched on their production targets. You mentioned a lot about cost of production rather than, say, cost of feed. Can you just run us through quickly what you mean by that?
I find a lot of people will talk about average daily gain. They want to target these huge weight gains, especially when we talk about finishing lambs. But ideally, our profit driver should be cost of gain. So what are they gaining per day, how much they're eating, what is the cost of our feed, and working out whether it's a profitable cost of gain or an expensive cost of gain, not just how much they're gaining. So to do that, we need to work out how much those lambs are eating, what our total ration cost is, not just the pellet or the grain component that they're eating, including the straw or the silage or the hay you're feeding in that, and then working out that weight gain over the total period of time to work out whether we're profitable or not.
Yep. So with that, are we looking every new pen of lambs we put in, we do those calculations, or once we get a feed ration that suits the lambs that we have, can we just then put through multiple pens of lambs in that sense?
Ideally, best practice would be to do every pen of lambs, but the system should be a replicated system unless something's changed drastically. So getting an idea of where you sit with one or a couple of pens of lambs, you should be able to do that.
Yep. Very good. Now, you've got plenty of experience in this area. Can you give us some feeding strategies maybe that have changed in the last... So someone might have been feedlotting during the droughts 5 years ago. Has anything significantly changed in that time, or are we doing the same thing?
The principles are the same. There's certainly things that have changed in terms of additives, but it's getting the basics right. So I tend to consult generally the advice we're giving the same as advice as we were in the droughts 10 years ago as the example, but it's getting those basic principles right and understanding that you are feeding a rumen environment which contains billions of microbes, and we need to introduce those feeds gradually. In terms of new things coming on the market, a lot of processors and the industry in general are reducing the use of antibiotics in feed, or ionophores is what we call them as nutritionists. So things like Bovatec and Rumensin. Those products are designed to shift the population of microbes to produce more propanoate, and the science doesn't matter, but that produces more glucose. So in intensive situations, ideally, that has an impact on feed conversion efficiency and weight gains, but also reduces things like coccidiosis in those intensive environments, so has a disease reduction. Obviously, the EU, those products have been banned, and a lot of processors are banning those when we're sending lambs to abattoirs. So the things that are new on the market are ways to counteract the use of reducing those ionophores in feed.
Right.
So there's been a lot of interest in things like essential oils, oregano being one, so oregano. It's an essential oil.
Oregano?
Yes.
Oregano.
Oregano.
In Bearsville, oregano.
But oregano is the product name.
Right.
So that improves enteric health, or
Right.
has a lot of claims against improving enteric health, and can reduce things like E. coli and salmonella. So reducing the use of ionophores and using some of these natural products like essential oils in these intensive systems is becoming more popular.
Now, we'll take a bit of a sideways step. Imagine you're coming out to our farm, looking at a feedlot pen. You walk through the pen. What things are you looking for as you walk through that pen?
So as a nutritionist, always check the feed and the feeding system. I will always ask you how much you think they're eating to work out whether they're on their set target. Always will check the hay or the straw or the silage that you're feeding. Obviously, in this case, you're feeding silage at the moment. And then
Which we won't tomorrow, don't worry.
You're feeding very good silage, and the risk is just that they'll overconsume and drop their intake of grain, but it comes back to your cost of gain as to whether that's profitable or not.
Potentially, we've got too much protein in the total
Potentially too
ration.
much protein, but we
Yep.
need to feed test it to work out how much.
Sure.
You're feeding a 16% pellet plus the additional vetch silage, which could be tipping that protein level over and has an impact on weight gains. And then I'd be checking animal health. So always look at manure score. You can tell a lot about your diet from manure. So check the consistency of that manure score, whether there's any bubbles or feed within that manure. And then looking at overall animal health. So is there lambs tucked up at the back of the pen? Are they all running to the feed system when it gets switched on, when they hear that noise? Ideally, we don't want them all eating at once. Checking things like lameness, overall bloom, whether those lambs are looking sappy and bloomy, and then what's happening within the pen. So we should have some lambs that are sitting down, some lambs that are playing with their pen mates, and then a portion of lambs coming to feed or at the feeder eating.
Sure. And you said that a regular time of day is also a very good thing to do.
Yeah,
so 10 o'clock
so
in the morning every morning.
Lambs like the same, or sheep in general, like to do the same thing every day, being a ruminant. So checking the pens at the same time is a really good habit to get into, because you can tell a lot about their behaviour. If they're on the same consistent feed diet and they're in a pen with their pen mates and haven't been disturbed, then they should be doing, ideally, the same thing every day. So you'll get to know whether something changes and there's an animal health issue or a feed issue within that pen just by their behaviour.
All right. And one other thing I just thought of now, once we sort of get past that 14-day induction time, we sort of tend to forget about them because there's not a whole lot of problems. Is that true to your experience once we get them past that?
So we should be checking them every day to make sure that they're eating a lot of grain in that time. So they'll eat about 3.8% of body weight or 4%. So we want to still be checking them every day, but it should be a consistent program after that. Obviously, with changes in weather and many factors that affect feed intake, they might drop their intake if it's coming in hot. We still want to be making sure that we're checking them, but we should have a consistent ration, and behaviour, animal health after that should be an easy process ideally.
Yeah, very good. And one thing that really struck me as interesting is that you don't like to weigh lambs while in a pen for a weight gain management, but as a data collector you do. Can you just run us through how many days it can knock them back if we take them out of the feed system?
Yeah, so as a nerd, I really like data. So I do like to work out what their growth rates are. We should be weighing them full at the start of the program, weighing them at the end of the program, and then ideally weighing them in the middle, because we do knock them back around 7 to 10 days, depending on how they're going into yards and whether they've been there many times prior. We do put a stress on that animal, and it does reduce their intake and how they perform for a period of time.
Very good. Now, this is one I'm going to throw at you from a curveball, but there's talk of shearing into or shearing mid Obviously, if we take them out to shear them during their program, it's going to knock them a long ways. Do you have a preference to shear into the pens, or is long wool fine?
This is a very topical issue at the moment. There's a lot of research that suggests shearing doesn't have any impact on weight gain. There's research to suggest that it does, that we open up the sunlight to the skin, which is vitamin D, which works in the calcium cycle and improves growth rate. The cost of shearing is probably the big one, and the market that you're selling to. So again, doing your budgets on what it is costing you to shear, and if there's no hindrance to the market that you're selling into by not shearing, then research is 50-50 at the moment.
Doesn't weigh up just yet too.
So your trials on shearing post and pre will give some indication of that further.
Yes, so just for the listeners, we're actually planning to do a bit of a trial where we shear some going into the feedlot pen. We'll leave some unshorn the whole time and then pull some out midway and shear them, and we'll be able to track their daily weight gains along that cycle and see if there is a marketed difference at the end. So stay tuned for that. Now, I know you just looked at your watch. I know you got time pressures to get out of here, so thank you for your time so far. But we've got a signature question that we asked all our guests at the end of each episode. And that question is, what have you learnt recently that has surprised you? So do you mind sharing what you've learnt recently that has surprised you?
So I'm going to break that question down into two, the learning part and then the surprise part. As you mentioned before, I'm a self-confessed nerd. As a perfectionist mentality, I like to keep learning. I'm not happy with I like to learn new things and progress, always try and be at the forefront of new information. But I'm also impatient and really giving away a lot of secrets now. So I like to do this in the quickest time as possible. I think AI technology, ChatGPT, has been a really good tool that I use.
Sorry, I thought you were going different AI then. We're talking about a farming podcast. Yes, AI. Yeah, artificial intelligence.
I think that's been a really good tool, and use it in day-to-day life, especially for finding out information. It can scan the internet and research articles straight away and bring them back to you in a really quick manner. I think that has surprised me in the way it does work and the learning ability and the knowledge that it provides. And the second thing is, and it is a work in progress, but as a mum of 2 kids under 3 and running a business as well, my mentality has always been to be as busy as possible in the past, very career orientated and business focused. And I think it's something that is the norm in agriculture. There's no 9 to 5. We work until the job's done, long hours, and it's seen probably as a theme in ag to do that. Having 2 kids has taught me to slow down and enjoy the little moments with them and have the occasional day off or spend some time with them or doing some things that I like as well. It's okay to do that, which has been the surprise. So I think...
As in okay in your own consciousness, or as in okay in your work performance?
So there's a lot of guilt when you're not working, I think, and especially for farmers in general, generally working long hours day to day until that job's done. But yeah, it's taught me recently that it is okay to not be in the business all the time and spending time elsewhere, and the wheels aren't going to fall off. And just as an example, there's been quite a bad feed deficit in the Western Districts over the last 8 months, becoming 12 months at the moment.
And something they're not too used to over there either.
Not used to at all. And monotonous days of feeding sheep and cattle for those producers with not a lot of time off farm. And something I've tried to encourage is to even get away from the farm for an hour, have a change of scenery, go to the bakery and have a pie and Coke or catch up with a friend. Has helped the mental health of some of those producers when it does become so tiresome and we're working all the time. So something that has surprised me is making time to have a few hours away from work and have a different change in mentality.
Yeah. Well, you growing up with a shearer as a father and a rouseabout mother, hard work was just part of who you are, I imagine, growing up. And so being able to shift gears and recognise that, it relates to a lot of farmers. When things get tough, what do? We seem to try and get tougher.
Keep working.
And so taking that time off, and it's surprising, so even only an hour you think could help during
I think just a change of scenery when you're driving in paddocks feeding sheep. every day, all day, just even going to town and having a change of scenery or talking to a friend, calling up a friend on the phone. Sometimes they're the best therapists to be able to just, do something different with the mind.
Yep. Now, I know that you've got a long drive ahead of you, and it's Will and Grace, is that correct?
Will and Grace,
yeah,
yes.
Your kids are waiting for you at home, so
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming in. What you've shared here has been really beneficial for the growers that came today, and hopefully this podcast will reach many more. So thanks, Jess, and safe travels.
Thanks, Al.
A big thank you for tuning in today. And remember, if you have a question about today's episode or a topic you'd like us to cover, reach out to one of our many platforms and join the conversation. We're here because of your passion and commitment to agriculture. Together, we can build a stronger farming future.
This podcast is made possible by the Future Drought Fund Regional Drought Resilience Planning Program, co-funded by the Victorian and Australian governments.